I'd like to start off with the question for Euphemia, because you went there right after the disaster happened, and then you've been back and forth several times. So what has happened since the disaster? Is Freetown in any way better prepared now? Should this happen again?
Well, since the mud and landslide happened in August last year, I personally haven't been back to Sierra Leone yet because of commitments here, and it's very expensive to go home. But I'm in close touch with a lot of the victims, and from what I gather, things have really gone from bad to worse, and it's sad to see because a lot of the victims are not getting any help. If anything, the whole country is wondering where the hundreds of millions that was raised and donated by countries, organizations have gone. So I haven't been back yet, but I am in close communication with some of the victims. I don't know if you want me to carry on.
Yes,
tell you a little bit more
I'd love
about.
to hear a little bit more about what people have been telling you. What is it like now to live in these precarious settlements?
There are so many factors that cause this landslide, but for me, predominantly, it comes to humans and the way the country is managed and the way the country is run. A lot of these people are very, very poor. They're very poor. They're living on the margins of society, and they don't have places to go. And like the video we saw, Nomads video we saw in Mongolia, it's because they're poor in the provinces, they're all flocking to Freetown. So Freetown is incredibly overcrowded. And they come in hundreds, and there's no policy. No one actually keeps track of these people. There's very little law and order in Sierra Leone, unfortunately. And so these people come and they buy these plots of land. I had planned to go to Sierra Leone on the 22nd of August, and then the flood and landslide happened on the 14th. So I was debating whether I should go back or not. My mom was like, "Don't go, it could happen again, and the place is still flooded." But I just thought, I'm still going to go, because if something like this happens and I just say I'm not going to go, I'm just turning my back on my people. You can't just attend to situations when it's convenient. So I raised funds and I went to Sierra Leone. I met these people, and their stories are horrendous. Before I traveled, I heard in the news that this was worse than even Ebola, and I was wondering how can it be worse than Ebola? It's just not possible. But this flood and landslide, they say flood, but I say landslide/sinkhole, because what actually happened was not what was first reported about landslide. It was a lot more sinister, because like the gentleman said, I met victims who told me that they had 3 bangs, and it's like the ground quite literally opened and swallowed houses, it swallowed families. And because these people are poor, they're living 9 members of family in a small shack, mom, sister, husband, children. And when this happened, it wipes them all out. So it was extraordinary. And the people they received no help. I met a gentleman who was cut all over his body. I mean, you think he had vitiligo, but it's all the stones that had knocked his skin off. And he was at the hospital, and he was saying that they were actually charging them to buy medicine. And if they couldn't buy the medicine, then they're not looked after. And he discharged himself from hospital, and I met him the following day. It's very difficult to blame the people, but it comes from the government. Because what we found out is that the president himself has a house in that same area. I actually saw it myself, been guarded by soldiers. You're not allowed to take pictures, and we found out that from the Minister of Land and Planning and the ministers in the government, they sold this one town lot, which is about as big as maybe about half the size of this room, to all these people who were desperate. So they sold all this piece of land, knowing what the dangers were. They did not monitor it. It was all a money-making thing. And then when this happened, it was quick to say, "Oh, we told these people not to build here, not to build here." But you sold them the land. You have a house here. And when I left Sierra Leone, I spent 3 weeks there. When I left, it was really heartbreaking. because I managed to raise a little bit of money and I wish I could do more, but these people were almost hanging on to my skirt, and because they weren't getting any help. They were being thrown out of the camps. The people who were put in charge of the camps were then bringing their relatives from the villages to benefit from all the donations. So we would see bags of rice, mattresses as far as 35 miles out of Freetown, and then the real victims weren't getting the help. I could go on. I'll hold on for someone else, but yeah, it was tough. It was tough. Like for example, one of the gentlemen that I met was a local tailor, and he has a workshop in the Mortimer area. I walked all those streets, and I actually recognized the gentleman in the film. I walked those. It's a very small community. It's a very small community, and they all know each other. They will sit at night, drink in the streets. Fires are going. It's a very, it's like a poor community, but they all know each other. And this tailor that I met, he lost his wife and his 3-year-old daughter in the flood and landslide. He has his workshop in the Mortimer area, and he spends nights there because, when orders come, you want to make the most of it. You don't know when you get another order. So he tends to stay overnight. And that night of the flood and landslide, he didn't go home. And that was the last he saw of his wife. It wiped out generations in one go. It was so sinister. He's the one that made this purse. I thought I'd bring it with me, handmade, and he did it with such diligence and hope for the future. And it's just great to raise awareness to these issues because these are real people. Sorry, I'll stop yapping away.
Not at all. I think this has been really interesting and very moving as well. I think the fact that people still show that amount of resilience in such dire circumstances never ceases to amaze me, and I think that's very important to always bear that in mind. And my next question is for Sarah, and I mean you work on these issues. What happens in those informal human settlements or slums, as they're commonly known? You work on these issues all the time, and what would you say, how can a city like Freetown even prevent such a disaster from happening in the future, or a city like Ulaanbaatar cope with people coming all the time? Is it just a question of throwing a lot of development money at it? I suppose not, but how can we even think about finding sustainable solutions?
Thank you, Astrid, and thank you, Euphemia. That was a really touching opening to this conversation. I guess I'm going to have some very bad panel etiquette and challenge the premise of your question. I hope you'll forgive me,
That's
Astrid.
very good.
Something that came through to me then, not so much from the film's production itself, but from some of the individuals in the film, was this story that urban growth is bad. To 2050, we're expected to have urban areas around the world grow by 2.5 billion people. 90% of that is going to be in low and middle income countries, particularly in Africa and Asia. And people are just terrified at that prospect. There's this vision of hordes of people moving to urban areas, and especially places like Freetown and Ulaanbaatar that are already struggling to provide basic services and infrastructure. And I guess I just want to kind of flip that on its head a bit. Urban population growth is one of the biggest opportunities that we have to tackle poverty, to accelerate economic development, even to deliver on some, if not all, of our sustainability goals. So economically, who here lives in a city? We all live in cities because cities are great places, right? They're places where there's job opportunities, where there's cultural opportunities. If you look at women in Africa who are moving to cities, if they were to stay in rural areas, they would not be able to inherit or own land and property through traditional paths. But if you move to cities, you can take part in markets. And so you have a chance to accumulate assets, even if you don't have a husband, or if your husband is not very generous in putting your name onto things. I think it's really important that we embrace the shift from rural to urban context as this opportunity to help meet some of these goals that we're all working towards. But of course, the process of doing this is really complex, and I think we saw that from these films today, where the challenge of people moving from livelihoods that have been part of their family for generations, or people moving to places where there's not basic services and infrastructure in place, pose this really personal human challenge, particularly when there's disasters, whether immediate disasters like a landslide or a long-term disaster like air pollution. So the challenge then is not how do we slow people moving to cities, but how do we get those cities right? Money is a part of it. There's a financing gap in terms of urban infrastructure of up to about 2.3 trillion every year. And governments are part of the answer, but they're not the whole answer. You know, if you were to take all of the government infrastructure investment of developing countries and all of the aid budgets from developed countries, you would still not cover that 2.3 trillion. So a lot of it is about finding that money and finding a community or household or private investment. But as Euphemia told us, sometimes you can throw all the money at the problem and it doesn't reach the people on the ground, whether that's badly managed aid or badly managed tax systems. And so governance, as Astrid started off by, so I'm coming back to agree with your premise of your question like a good interviewee.
You can come again.
Governance is the most important thing. How can you get particularly local governments where the citizens who live in cities can influence their behaviour, hold them to account, and make sure that the money that they pay in taxes or that is given to them by international donors and national governments is spent in ways that protects them from risks and helps meet these really urgent needs like clean water, sanitation, and protecting them from hazards such as landslides.
Anna, I mean, this is if we embrace cities and the opportunities for growth, I think there are also opportunities in rural areas for people who actually don't want to migrate. I think in the Mongolia film it was quite clear that some of the younger people really wanted to go to the city, but others went because they had no choice. So what needs to happen in rural areas, in villages, to make people stay there and have opportunities?
I mean, that's a really, really good question. I wanted to also pick up on what Sarah was saying about urbanisation being an opportunity, not just challenge, and that sounds strange for someone who works particularly on rural areas, but also just pointing out that urban migration is not actually currently the main source of urban growth. It's still an important source, but it's no longer the main source of that. But there is this inherent fear of people flocking to cities, and actually the number of countries, the percentage of countries that have put in place policies to try to stop that or to slow it has increased. It went up from about 39-40% of countries in 1996 to 80% in 2013, but largely they've actually been really ineffective. So I think we've got to think about that as well. They've been ineffective, and many of these policies have actually increased the cost and the danger to migrants moving to urban areas. That's not to say that we shouldn't put in anything in place to safeguard the most vulnerable people moving, or to encourage people to stay. And I guess, I mean, the Mongolia film showed that there is definite room for systematic support and actually greater regulation by the government to promote sustainable land management. And I say systematic because the example given of support was, here's a bale of hay and here's a bag of fodder, and that's going to be quite sporadic. But actually building the resilience of herders and regulating the intensity of grazing is a sort of a no-brainer, I think. So there seems to be sort of a trick being missed there. And there was certainly something coming through from the government officials that we've moved from socialism to a sort of rampant free market economy, and very divided opinion on whether that's the right thing. But a sense of maybe that's going to be moved back to a more regulated market economy. So I think that is one thing. But actually I would like to think about how to make the most of migration to improve life in rural areas, because again, in the Mongolia film there is a sort of very binary picture put forward. We've got two separate cultures. I mean, in reality, there's the linkages between urban and rural areas are much, much stronger. And people who migrate to urban areas often are still going back to their villages and sending money back, and that money can be incredibly important as a source of funds for investment. Some of it is spent in sort of just direct consumption, but some of that is invested in housing, in irrigation, actually school fees as well to improve our education. So I would actually argue that there is a very sort of easy thing that the government could do to facilitate those remittances, reduce the cost of those remittances, facilitate collective remittances back, where in many countries in Africa that's shown to have been invested in social infrastructure for communities in rural areas and making life work better for people. I mean, and if you look at international remittances, on average, to send $200 from the African diaspora back to Africa, it's 12% commission, and the cost of internal remittances are much the same. And if you look at the volume of remittances, I mean, internationally it's about $430 billion. That's more than overseas development assistance. We don't have really good figures for many countries, but if you look at China, internal remittances were $30 billion. So that's a huge source of income for improving life in rural areas and making it more attractive for people to stay. But I would also say that you need to have better information about who is migrating and where from, so you can have targeted intervention. Because some of the herders in Mongolia were doing really well. I mean, they were saying the richer herders, and the overall livestock, they said it had tripled. I'm not sure if it was actually in the film, but actually in the background information, it's tripled over the last sort of 10 years. So even though some people are losing their herds, losing their livelihoods, the overall number of livestock has increased. So some people are really benefiting and wanting to stay in rural areas for that. So thinking about who is actually migrating, who of those people are really vulnerable and need to have safeguards put in place, and how to make that process a smoother and safer one, which can work backwards and benefit the rural areas.
Thank you, Anna. I think that's an important point as well, the lack of good data, good information about who is migrating, who arrives in the city, and how do these people make a living is very important to get a better handle on how to make this work better. Charles, so cities have a lot of problems, we've heard about that, but they're also centers of energy and creativity. Given all the pressures that cities face today, can cities be creative and economic engines, and that can really work to become the source for a better world altogether that is more equitable, that gives people the opportunity to have good housing, decent jobs, all the things we all really want for ourselves and our children and future generations?
Well, there are so many questions wrapped up in that. I mean, obviously, cities are accelerators of opportunity and all of that, and obviously that's where most wealth is created, but also because most people are there, of course. But I think so I'll loop around your questions a bit. If you take an eagle-eye view of everything, obviously we know that what happens elsewhere shapes what's happened here. And if you take that eagle-eye view, you can see that there's a vast fragility occurring, and the systems of management and organisation and politics simply can't cope with the escalating range of wicked problems. And then again, because places and people are becoming overwhelmed, I mean, we all know that the world is turning to its darker face. Apprehension is in the air. The zeitgeist is one of rising anxiety. I mean, it feels like Weimar in 1929, actually, when you think about it in terms of the potential tensions. So when also the grey zone disappears and people talk about globalists and patriots and divide the world in these sort of things, and we see the things like Brexit, Trump, and all of these other things that are happening, a lot of that is to do with, for example, also the immersive effects of digitization, which is obviously on one hand wonderful, on the other hand, some people find it exciting, of course it is, and others find it scary. But one thing that is never mentioned is, because I'm relatively old, when I was born there were 2.2 billion people on the earth. Now that we're about to hit 7.9. Now, let's just ponder that, okay, what that means. Okay, and pondering what that means is that every half child less we have, and the continent with the greatest birth rate is Africa, 4.4 per person, which means that Nigeria will become larger than America in terms of population relatively shortly. So 1 point less child means we can stabilise where we are, but as trend's going, it's going to 11 billion. And when you were born, it was probably, I don't know, I'm looking at you, you know, it was 3, 4, depends how old you are, but anyway, it's going up. And for me then, that is partly an explanation, that's why I wrote The Civic City and the Nomadic World, so I'll pick up the nomadic if you don't mind, where really then the big central question is, where do we belong when everything is on the move? The world is in motion. The city is in motion, it's completely transforming, continually things are being built and rebuilt and, you know, whatever, shards are coming up and breaking up or whatever. The question then is, what are the zones of encounter? Because all these people are mostly strangers. The city, in essence, is a place where strangers meet. And the question is, and there are obviously reasons for city trading and all that sort of stuff, and how do you create places of empathy when, I'm not saying we should all love each other, by the way, but how do you create places of empathy when people are strangers to each other, when they are overwhelmed? Now, who are these nomads? The nomads, they're shrinking, the Tuaregs and all of that, and the Mongolian ones are shrinking. There are, of course, all these other nomads, the Roma, the travellers. There's about 1 million people in India who are nomads, who are sort of, I don't know, fortune tellers and things like that. So there's a vast number of traditional nomads, but the modern nomad is the person who comes to the vortex city. London is a vortex city which sucks people in, and sucks, in a sense, the ambitious and all of that. Berlin is a vortex city, Amsterdam is, Lisbon is becoming one. The next fashionable city will be Athens. Because people are looking global capitalism, moving around and can see the differences and all of that. I don't want to bang on about that. But anyway, so there are shrinking cities and growing cities. There are many shrinking cities, believe it or not, as growing cities in Europe. And so then these young people, perhaps. Then there are the backpackers, the year-out people. There are 6 or 8 million foreign students in Europe and America and China. There are 130 times as many international tourists as there were 50 years ago. There are expats in corporations, blah, 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 blah. And that's about 1 billion people on the move, moving from rural to urban areas in China, 250 million. So this vast movement, and then the blending of the digital and the real, in quotes, world, is creating sort of tension. So let's come to creativity. Creativity, the original idea, was all about when people were in transformations, how do you create the conditions for people to think, plan and act with imagination in order to create opportunities and solve problems in cities, for example, in Britain, you know, the Sheffields and all of that. So that's the core idea. But then, you know, lots of people who were artists said, well, of course, creative, the word creative's in it, must be me. Sorry, I'm exaggerating, I don't mean that. But obviously there are many realms of creativity, and there has always been creativity from below, of course, because creativity is essentially about solving problems and creating opportunities. So there's a vast spectrum of it. And so if you're talking about focus now, the big focus for me is about dealing with the intractables. And the intractables are these dysfunctional places, because many places are becoming dysfunctional, and dealing with things when the government arrangements are completely incapable, and politics are completely incapable of blending together how these things that need to be addressed in an integrated way. And that is such a crisis of massive proportions. So, of course, we all know what needs to happen. The Habitat Summit that happens every 20 years said that cities are the solutions to the problems. Habitat, of course, is a global national state thing. But they don't have the legitimacy often in place the place where the problem is to deal with the actual solutions. So we know the solutions. The solutions are easy. When you read that Habitat agenda, which all says how we should run cities, missed out all those points about corruption and all of that stuff, crime, all of that, it's also, we want inclusive cities. Of course, not bloody inclusive cities. Do we want uninclusive cities? We want educated cities. Do we want stupid cities? No. Do we want sustainable cities? Yes. Do we want unsustainable cities? No. So the question is really turning these things into reality and making the solutions happen. That's a slightly negative note. So how can I end? I think imagination is there. I'll just end on one tiny point, big point, vast point. There's a major battle between classic democracy. Most things have been reinvented, business models, lots of stuff, yeah. But what hasn't been reinvented is how we manage and rule ourselves, govern ourselves. And obviously that's why you get the crowd urbanism, the pressure from below. Again, when you take the helicopter view, you can see vast pressures coming of people to wanting to be more involved in making, shaping and co-creating their places. So I'll just leave it at that for a sec. Sorry, forever.
Thank you, Charles. I think there's a lot to be said for creativity in trying to solve these problems. But what also resonated with me is that while states and governments have the authority to make the rules, they increasingly lack the legitimacy, and I think that is also a huge challenge that cities in particularly face. I think we have about a bit of time left, and I'm really keen to get your questions from the audience.
Thank you so much for being here. And I'm just curious about you talked about sovereignty and governance, about corporates sort of superseding some of the local governments around sustainability, around planning. With Nestle and water, you have different aspects like that where corporates are now going in and investing in land where people are starving, so that the food is actually being shipped out. So I'm curious how that plays with what you all are looking at.
You mean like China buying chunks of Africa, you mean, or something?
Yeah.
Something Sarah can picture?
Sure. So actually, I think that is something that is very striking in London at the moment, where I don't know, I'm very sorry again for pitching another outlet at this point. The Guardian has been doing some really good coverage recently around the corporatisation of what seems to be public space in London. But it turns out that if you hold a protest there, for example, that the property owners and the real estate developers can go in and kick you out. So I think this is actually a universal problem in vortex cities all the way through to Freetown and some of the small struggling cities. I guess maybe some people on the panel can comment on this specifically. To my mind, this taps into really big discussions around what is the role of the state, what is the role of the private sector, what is the role of civic society. The more I work in this space, the more I think that a lot of the UN Habitat and other big forums are really missing that civic society component. There is, in the UK as elsewhere, there is the revolving door between the Treasury and some of the big finance organisations and big management consultancies and so on. They have trouble regulating it here with all of the apparatus of a very sophisticated state. And so I think we can have very little hope for somewhere like Tanzania or Mongolia effectively governing some of that relationship, unless you have an organised communities, urban-specific communities, but a whole range of different civic structures that can hold governments to account, that can collectively act through their purchasing power to influence the behaviour of governments and corporations. I think we see some really fantastic work around that in urban contexts. So, for example, organised groups of slum dwellers, Shack Dwellers International, the Asian Coalition of Housing Rights, organised networks of street vendors and traders. By working collectively, these can bring together sort of from dozens to hundreds to thousands of urban residents in a single place, because place is really important, but also globally to raise the profile of these issues. So where states are unable or unwilling to act, working through civic society can be a means to strengthen their hand or strengthen their incentives to do so.
I just comment on the corporatisation of land? Because actually I think I've been quite encouraged over the last 5 years, particularly about the power of local communities to exert some power. And I think I think we have to be a little bit careful because there are big numbers put out there about how much land has been taken over by private companies, and a lot of that is not actually well founded in terms of those huge numbers. The whole of Tanzania being, or something equivalent to the size of France being taken over. So I would just caution that there's not as much happening as it seems, but that's not to be complacent because there, in localized areas, there are definitely issues. But we're doing at the moment a project quantifying tenure risk. So it's actually saying to companies, it's going to cost you this much on your bottom line if you don't do the land issues right. And the companies we're looking at, there are companies that have gone bankrupt or have had their operations stalled for many years because local communities have said enough. So I suppose I was just trying to say, not to be complacent, but I'm quite encouraged by some of the local communities exerting their power over this perceived corporatisation of land in rural areas.
I mean, I suppose another point is can the market on its own solve the problems that are there? And I suppose one has to work with and against the market simultaneously, and that implies bending the market to bigger picture ethical purposes, if ethical means in this context trying to reduce the division, for example, between rich and poor. And there are interesting examples, just to pick one in Germany, for example, in Berlin, a whole series of foundations, bizarrely enough Swiss foundations, are buying key sites to take them out of the speculation market, particularly on things like the riverfront, where you would normally have a skyscraper. Holzmarkt is, you can look it up, just as an example. But there are quite a few of those. But bureaucratic reinvention is a massive task because the public bureaucracies have been basically maligned for 30, 40 years. Now, any problem that is complex clearly needs these tripartite interests, civic society, the public bureaucracy, private energy, working together in some way, picking up the bureaucracy. You obviously have heard of things like the Living Lab movement, which are doing many experiments. There are 600 members around the world of these entities. There's the Laboratorio para la Ciudad in Mexico City, which is a provocation inserted of 22 people, funny enough, run by a filmmaker, Gabriela Gomez Mont, which is providing solutions that wouldn't happen through the natural process of a public administration. Adelaide, South Australia, has something called the 90-day projects where citizens can say, I want a problem solved in 90 days. The only reason why it may work is because the Premier has agreed that this is okay. That's to do with hierarchy. But nevertheless, I'm just saying there are many examples of that. And just to be a bit egotistical for the moment, we're organising an event which is called the Creative Bureaucracy Festival in Berlin on the 8th, 9th of September, where we're bringing together some of these solutions from around the world. Anyway, you can look that up. But the point being is the public has been maligned for so long, that thing called the public sector, and within it they're not all stupid. And having interviewed literally hundreds of them and done case studies in many cities, there's talent to be tapped, but they feel trapped by the systems that they operate in. Longer discussion, but I'll leave it at that.
Any more questions? Mike's coming.
Yeah, I just want to ask, I've Sierra Leone actually, because I've worked there since the 80s. Really interesting. It was a great film actually, I thought it was very accurate. And I just went back after Ebola. So what struck me about Freetown when I went back, so it was like 25 years, was how much bigger it was. And I think the million figure is massively understated. I think it's nearer 3 million people now live there post-conflict. So it's kind of unrestrained development and deforestation. Now those hills that we saw in that used to be forest. There was, there's nothing up there. So And deforestation is not an urban problem in Sierra Leone, I think, is, you know, it's kind of it's a general problem. Deforestation is a massive problem. Government failure to regulate and capacity to regulate is kind of a fundamental problem that Sierra Leone's got. So, I really want to ask, you know, how do you fix that? What is it that you think should, you know, that the international community or whoever it is should be doing to fix that problem of regulation, capacity to regulate?
I'll start. To be honest, I don't really know where to start with Sierra Leone. It is on a completely different planet. I'm a proud Sierra Leonean, but you have to go to Sierra Leone to really understand how Sierra Leone functions. There is no law and order. There's nowhere you can complain. Your neighbor can decide to burn down your house because you upset them. You go to the local police. If he's been paid more by the neighbor, or he's good friends by the neighbor, your case is what they call a buff case. Sierra Leone, especially Freetown, it is a free for all. It breaks my heart because there's no system. There's so many issues that we've had in such a very small country that's incredibly rich in resources that should have never happened. And it stems from leadership. Through Ebola, my mother's sister, my aunt, my first aunt, you can research this, she was the 4th doctor officially named to die from service through Ebola. So I'm directly connected to all of these issues. And millions and millions was raised by the international community. Now this is going to sound controversial what I'm about to say, but I honestly wish that none of that went to the people in charge, because some of that Ebola money was supposed to actually be used to help the victims. And you would think in countries like this that we live in, the UK, someone like that who lost her life, she was adamant to serve her. We spoke to her 2 days before, and she started coughing and she was sick and she was still insisting to go out. And you think somebody like that in countries like this would be not hailed, but they would be celebrated, they would be honoured. And you have doctors, nurses who lost their lives. And to this day, our family, not that we care about it, but I can tell you firsthand that not a drop of that money has gone to any victim in Sierra Leone. The governments have come and gone. What the people call it in Sierra Leone, it's like a business now. Governing in Sierra Leone is not governing, it's a business. It's a way for you to come in, make some money, get rich, fatten your pension, and leave. And through the modern landslide as well, not a penny went to these victims. I've met some people with horrendous stories. You see grown men crying like children, sobbing because they've lost everything. And you just think, where is the concern? And for something like that to change, honestly, Sierra Leone is on the level of corruption in Sierra Leone and lawlessness is not like anywhere in this world. It is something else. There's nowhere to report anything. From the highest authority to the local teacher. My cousin actually came over from Sierra Leone, the daughter of my aunt who passed. She's also in medicine. She came over last year, stayed with us to do her master's for a year. She went back. And things like envelopes and papers and things like that, she eventually has to put money in from her salary to buy office stationery when they're getting the report in the budget to say the Ministry of Education has given her facility, the leader of a facility, this amount of budget to run the facility, nothing. They're just pocketing money and there's no regulation. And I honestly don't know where to start. I would really genuinely from the bottom of my heart like to just shed some light on Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone is a lost place and the international community don't really have any idea. And for things like this to not happen again, we need a miracle. We need a complete overhaul of government. We need a complete overhaul of everything because funds are coming in but they're not going to the people at all. And you will hear from every single case honestly, when I was growing up, we would say, compare Sierra Leone with Ghana, Nigeria, other African countries to say, oh, this is our competition. No, sorry, we'd compare, Sierra Leone with England and London. This is your competition. Like, this is what would like it to be like. But now, you can't even compare Sierra Leone to another African country. We've been left, it's a forgotten nation, and we need a miracle. And for things to change, for investment, for proper management of the land, of the resources. Honestly, we need a miracle. We probably need international help, to be honest with you, at this stage, because that's the only way things are going to change. Because the people they're being kept blind as well by the government. They're fairly uneducated. They don't have any resources or power to change the world, to change what's around them. They're desperate for somewhere to live. So if someone says, I'm going to sell you that piece of land, you just dig. There's no planning. People put shacks up with no foundation. Nobody cares. Nobody comes to check. And I know there was one minister, I think a couple years ago, before this disaster actually happened, who went to the Motorme area and warned and tried to warn people, the few good men left in Sierra Leone trying to do an honest work, tried to warn these people. He was arrested. He was arrested by officials. They beat him up, and I'm sad to say they beat him to death. They killed him because they did not want him. We have rumors of these officials apparently gluing his mouth with super glue, just because he was there warning the people and trying to get the government officials to take responsibility. We're somewhere where we need divine intervention in Sierra Leone, some law and order, because if this will happen again, it definitely will happen again. I don't know if anyone else.
I wouldn't dare comment on the specific case of Sierra Leone, which sounds incredibly complex. But perhaps there are some lessons for other cities that have opportunities instead. So the first thing that I've seen that is most effective is actually cities working together to learn from each other. There are a number of city networks, C40, ICLEI, UCLG, where anywhere between 100 and 2,000 cities work together to share lessons on what has and hasn't worked. And the reason this is so effective is that city officials can be honest with each other in a way that they can't necessarily with national governments or international donors. So you can sit down with your counterpart in the Department for Transport and say, I have no idea what this regulation means, or we have no idea how to bundle in these property lots, or I have no idea what a bus network is, whatever your question might be. And I think this picks up on Charles' points about creativity and imagination, because actually, if you have these networks, cities only need to imagine something once and have it work in one place, and then cities all over the world can learn. So Curitiba in Brazil and then Bogota in Colombia developed a bus rapid transit network, which is basically cost about 10% as much as a metro, but carries the same amount of people. And now there are over 400 in the world. Bike sharing, the former Boris bikes, now the Sadiq cycles, were learned from, I think, Paris and Amsterdam. There's lots of examples.
Well, the Amsterdam one, but before digitisation, they all got stolen, and then the next one was Helsinki. They still got stolen, and that's where digitisation really comes in, you see, because now you can track them when they don't get stolen. Sorry, I'm just saying, because the first ones were 1990, and the next one, sorry, they're being pedantic, but I'm just saying it's useful about the modern technology sometimes.
No,
helps.
I would trust you on this. You started working in the 1980s when I was born.
Yes.
Very good. Do we have time
That
for
wasn't too shame.
a couple more questions?
Myself.
No, I'm just agreeing with you. Yeah, I agree with you.
Do we have time for a couple more questions? Yeah.
I'm full of sympathy for Sierra Leone, but I live by Grenfell Tower, and I think it's very easy for us to be complacent. I was at the Kensington Society last night, and I used the phrase economic apartheid and referred to money laundering, and they didn't want to know. The chief executive said, I reject that phrase. You know, there are also completely abandoned cities. I don't mean to be pessimistic. I mean, I think there's hope, and I think in a funny kind of way, the global thing and the climate change and the environment, you know, every few hundred years, the planet has to reorganize itself, you know, and it needs both levels. You know, so I'm not without hope. But I was there at 6 o'clock in the morning. The council wasn't. We are a local community. We all recognised each other. But we buck the trend in a city. We are the Neanderthals and the dinosaurs.
Any more questions over there?
Hi, I've got a question about your need. You're saying about there needs to be a strong civic society, and what was interesting about both films was that the narrative from the overall narrative when you watch them was about they need better governance, but the narrative from the people actually in the situations was there's more rains. So climate change has almost become an excuse for governments, not all governments, people not to actually do what they're supposed to be doing as a deflection, which I think that weakens the demands from civic societies.
And the point.
So do you think the sort of emphasis that seems to be, or the narrative that seems to be from the victims, that the grasses are getting weaker, obviously there's governance reasons for that, for the lack of grass, and there's also governance reasons for those mudslides. It isn't the rains, obviously increasing, but so I'm trying to say that basically their narrative is a climate change narrative. The victims actually is really about governance and building resilience from those societies, and it's almost like lessening their demand from the state or from the people governing. So it's weakening their power in a way.
Sorry, is it weakening the power of civil society?
Yes, because there's this alternative evil, which is beyond their ability to deal with. And is that making their demands less? Are they less demanding as a result?
I can start with that unless someone else wants to.
Please do.
So I guess my understanding of both of those problems would be that you have multiple factors compounding each other. So as Freetown has reached 3 million was the estimate I most recently heard, that creates all of these changes in the built environment, which means that perhaps rain is not as absorbed as much. There's increased demand for charcoal, so you have deforestation, so the slopes are more vulnerable. And then you also have heavier rains. So I think that there is an emphasis around a changing climate, and people can see that very visibly, and they don't necessarily link the changes in the climate with the changes in their landscape that exacerbate these problems. I guess a lot of the work that I see and try to do at the moment is trying to identify or trying to demonstrate that, particularly in cities more than in other parts of countries, actions to tackle climate change or actions to pursue lower carbon paths of development actually help to tackle a whole string of other problems at the same time. This is a narrative that I think is not picked up often enough in sort of public thinking and political discourse, either civil society or the public sector. So for example, having people walk, cycle or use public transport is lower carbon, but people don't invest in good transport systems for climate change. They do it because a city with a good underground, a good bus network, safe cycle lanes is a better place to live. It's a more productive economy. There's more interaction between people. Somewhere like Colenbrander, they're not getting rid of coal will be good for climate change, but they're not getting rid of it for that reason. They're getting rid of it because the air quality is horrendous. And so I think you're right to say that in a lot of cases people, not in all cases, but in a lot of cases people are outsourcing their problems. It's beyond us, it's a global issue, the weather is changing, there's nothing we can do as your local authority. I think changing that narrative to say you can deliver better development by doing it in a climate compatible way offers a chance to kind of reconcile that and to strengthen civil society's arms in those debates.
And plus the point you made earlier about some of those networks, which obviously then give confidence and courage to those people to say it's not just something we can't do anything about, because you're basically saying 1 + 1 can equal 3.
But I think also, there's a real role for civil society, and we're picking up on this, the narrative, to make sure that the government structures are not sort of distracting from a core, the core problem, so that they can actually be saying, no, it is a bundle of factors, and actually even if it is climate change, you still have something to do about it. The Mongolia one was actually very much about the fact that there was no regulation, so there was overgrazing. So it wasn't only climate change, actually, it was the system that was in place. And I think civil society has a huge role in making sure that all those different factors are brought to attention.